I walked into my sister's birthday party, early to help set up, just in time to hear her tell her friends, "I'm so sick of my pathetic sister thinking we're close." Then my aunt walked in and asked one question that made the whole room go silent. "I'm so sick of my pathetic sister thinking we're close." I heard it before I even saw her face. I'd come early with the cake, just like she asked. 2-tier fondant, hand-sculpted roses, 2 nights of work. I set it on the counter so I wouldn't drop it. Chloe burst out laughing. "Tell her what you said about the Christmas thing." "Chloe, shut up," Victoria groaned, but Chloe wouldn't stop. "You said she bought you that Tiffany necklace thinking it meant something, and she cried when you gave her a $50 gift card. I'd saved 6 months for that necklace." "I'm basically her free therapist," Victoria said, pouring more wine. "Real therapy costs money." I stepped into the room. "You asked me to come early to help." Every head turned. Victoria's face went pale, then hard. "I asked you to drop off the cake. Don't make this weird. You call me every night." "Because I'm bored," she said. "You're convenient." Convenient. The word landed like a slap. Chloe pulled the scrapbook out from under the coffee table. 3 months of my work, our whole childhood in photos. "Look at this pathetic thing," Victoria said, flipping it open. She wrote, "My amazing sister inspires me every day." The room laughed. "I felt bad for you," Victoria said, looking right at me. "You don't have real friends, so I let you think we were close. These are my real sisters." She waved at Chloe, Becca, Janet. "You're just someone I share DNA with." She lifted the cake box and dragged her finger through a fondant rose, smearing it. "This cake is trying way too hard," she said. "Professional bakers exist for a reason. Grocery store energy." Chloe snorted. "And you're not going to be my maid of honor," Victoria added, smiling like she'd saved the best for last. "Brad's proposing next month. Chloe's my maid of honor. You're not even invited to the bachelorette." I'd been planning that bachelorette in my head for 2 years. "But I'm your sister," I said. "Exactly. My sister. Not my friend. There's a difference." Becca leaned in, eager to pile on. "Remember the surprise party she threw you? The one you said you didn't want? I'd planned that party for weeks, after Victoria told me she felt forgotten on her last birthday. I cried because I was mortified," Victoria said, laughing. "She invited people from high school I haven't talked to in years. Who does that?" "You said you loved it," I whispered. "You said you cried happy tears." "What was I supposed to say?" Victoria shrugged. "You looked so proud of your little gesture." The doorbell rang. More guests arriving. Victoria grabbed my arm, nails biting into my skin. "Leave the cake and go," she hissed. "I decorated this whole place, and it looks like a kid's party. We're redoing it." Then, loud enough for the new arrivals to hear, she delivered the final cut. "You know the saddest part? She actually thinks we have some special bond because our parents died. Like trauma automatically makes you close." She poured another drink. "That bonding stuff is fake. I have real friends for emotional support." The room went quiet, just long enough for it to sink in. The front door opened again. Aunt Helen stepped in, coat still buttoned, gift bag in hand. "What's going on here?" she asked, looking at my face, then the ruined cake. Victoria's mask snapped back on. "Oh, Aunt Helen, you're early. My sister was just dropping off the cake. She can't stay. She's got plans." Janet, 3 glasses deep, laughed too loud. She was just saying how sick she is of pretending to like her sister. The words hung there like smoke. Aunt Helen turned to Victoria, slow and deliberate. New guests were still filing in behind her, crowding the entryway, watching. "Pretending?" Aunt Helen said. Her voice cut clean through the music and the chatter, loud enough for every single person in that doorway to hear. "Your sister who pays half your rent," she said, "because you can't afford it on your own?" Victoria's face went from red to white in under a second. Nobody laughed this time. I need to back up 6 years to explain why that single sentence from Aunt Helen landed the way it did, and why it took me until that exact moment, standing over a ruined cake in a kitchen I'd helped decorate, to finally stop making excuses for someone I'd been quietly holding together since I was 24 years old. I'd been the one who answered the phone the night a state trooper called about our parents' car accident on I-94, 6 years ago this past March. I was 24, Victoria was 20. I drove 4 hours through sleet to get to her dorm before the university could send someone less gentle to tell her, and I remember the specific, useless detail that I still carry around, that I was wearing mismatched socks, one gray and one navy, and that some part of my brain fixated on that the entire drive because it was easier than fixating on anything else. Our parents, Carl and Linda, left behind a modest life insurance payout and the sale proceeds from the house, structured by an estate attorney into 2 separate trusts. Mine, which I could access at 25 with no conditions, and Victoria's, which the attorney recommended staggering in phases given her age, and what he diplomatically called her spending patterns, with full access not arriving until she turned 30, or married, whichever came first, with smaller scheduled disbursements. In between, that required a co-signature from me as the designated family contact on the account. I never asked for that role. The attorney assigned it because I was older, because someone had to be, and because in the chaos of that spring, I was the one who showed up to every meeting with a notebook, while Victoria, understandably, fell apart in ways 19-year-olds are allowed to, and 24-year-olds rarely get permission to. I remember sitting in that attorney's office, 11 days after the funeral, taking notes on trust disbursement schedules while Victoria stared out the window, and thinking, with a kind of grim clarity I didn't have language for yet, that grief had just quietly handed me a second unpaid job I hadn't applied for. I moved my own life around hers for the better part of 2 years after that, drove 3 hours every other weekend to check on on her, picked up extra freelance design work specifically so I could quietly cover the gap between her part-time income and her rent, told myself the whole time that this was simply what sisters did when the only two people who'd ever fully had your back were suddenly gone. I gave up an apartment lease of my own that first year, choosing a cheaper studio across town specifically so I'd have more flexibility to drive out and stay with her on short notice, a decision I never once mentioned to her because it felt, at the time, like the kind of thing you weren't supposed to keep score of. I want to be honest that I didn't see the early red flag for what it was back then, because grief makes you generous in ways that are very hard to walk back later. Victoria leaned on me completely those first 2 years. 3-hour phone calls, every crisis routed through me first, every decision run past me before her own friends ever heard about it. I told myself that was closeness. I'm not sure, looking back, that it was ever anything other than convenience with better lighting. And the first loop came 18 months after the funeral, when Victoria signed a lease on her first solo apartment and asked me to co-sign, since her income alone didn't meet the building's requirement. I agreed without much thought, the way you agree to anything for someone you've just watched lose both parents in the same week. What I didn't fully register until almost a year later, going through my own bank statements for taxes, was that I'd been quietly covering roughly $600 of her $400 monthly rent the entire time, transferred the same week her own paycheck cleared, framed every time as, just this month I'll pay you back. I built a small spreadsheet that first tax season, mostly out of professional habit, and then closed it almost as soon as I'd opened it, unwilling to look directly at a running total I already suspected I wouldn't like. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that for 4 straight years. The second loop was the surprise party, 2 years ago, the one Becca brought up that night like a weapon. Victoria had told me the week before her birthday that she felt forgotten the previous year. Nobody had organized anything, she said, and she cried about it on the phone for almost an hour while I sat on my bathroom floor holding the phone with my shoulder, taking notes on a sticky pad about which old friends she might want there. I spent 3 weeks planning a surprise gathering after that call, tracking down old friends from her childhood through people I hadn't spoken to in a decade myself, renting a small venue with money that was supposed to go toward my own car repair, which I ended up putting on a credit card instead, and paying down slowly over the following winter. She cried when she walked in. I remember thinking, in the moment, watching her hands fly up to her mouth in the doorway, that it was the happiest I'd seen her in over a year. I told myself the work had been worth it. I held on to that memory for 2 years before I found out, secondhand, through Becca's careless mouth, that the tears had apparently meant something else entirely. The third loop was the necklace, this past Christmas. 6 months of saving from my freelance income. A thin gold chain with a single pendant from Tiffany, the kind of gift I'd never once bought myself, wrapped in the same blue box I remember staring at in the store for almost 20 minutes before I let myself actually buy it. Victoria opened it and went quiet for a long moment before saying it was beautiful. She gave me a $50 gift card to a chain restaurant we'd been to maybe twice together, tucked into an unsealed envelope with no card attached. I felt something complicated rise in my chest that I told myself was gratitude for any gift at all, not the disappointment it actually was. And I cried a little in the bathroom afterward, telling myself it was just holiday emotion, the first Christmas-adjacent ache of missing our parents. Nothing about the gift card specifically. I didn't know until that night in her kitchen that my reaction had been recorded somewhere in her memory as a punchline, instead of a private moment she'd promised, implicitly, to never bring up again. The fourth loop was the scrapbook, 3 months of evening work spread across a winter. Every photo we had left of our parents, captions I'd written and rewritten until they said exactly what I meant, a project I'd started after a particularly hard session with my own therapist where I'd talked about wanting to build something solid out of memories that otherwise felt like they were dissolving a little more each year. I worked on it most nights after my freelance clients had gone quiet, glue and trimmed photo corners spread across my kitchen table for the better part of a season, listening to old playlists our mother used to put on during Sunday cleaning. I gave it to Victoria for no occasion at all, just because I thought she might want it too. I found out, that night in her kitchen, that it had been sitting under her coffee table the entire time, not as a treasured object, but as material for a bit she apparently performed for her friends when she wanted a laugh. The fifth loop was the calls themselves, the nightly pattern I'd quietly accepted as simply being part of who we were to each other. Hour-long conversations about her work stress, her relationship anxieties, her family complaints that I slowly began to realize only in hindsight never once left room for a reciprocal question about my own week. There was a particular Tuesday, about 8 months ago, when I'd had a genuinely difficult day at work. A client had dropped a project I'd spent 6 weeks on, and I mentioned it briefly at the start of one of those calls, only to have Victoria redirect within 90 seconds back to a disagreement she'd had with a coworker, never once circling back to ask how my own situation had resolved. I brought this up gently to my own therapist 8 months ago, describing it as just how Victoria processes things, the same rationalization I'd been making for years. My therapist asked a single question that I didn't have a good answer for. When was the last time she asked you something about your life and then actually waited to hear the answer? I sat with that question for the rest of the session in a silence I didn't know how to fill. But I went to people whose job it was to help me see the shape of what I'd actually built around my sister, because by the night of that party, I'd finally stopped trusting my own instinct to explain her behavior away on her behalf. Dr. Naomi Cross, a licensed clinical psychologist with 15 years in practice, had been seeing me for 8 months by the time of the party, originally for what I'd described to her as ordinary grief processing. It became, over those 8 months, something closer to untangling a pattern I hadn't let myself name. "What you're describing isn't closeness," she told me 3 sessions before the party, after I'd recounted the scrapbook conversation Victoria and I had supposedly shared. "Closeness has reciprocity built into it. What you're describing is a one-directional support system that you've been quietly subsidizing, financially and emotionally, for 6 years." I didn't like hearing it. I wrote it down anyway, in the small notebook I'd started keeping specifically for things Dr. Cross said that I wasn't ready to fully accept yet. By the week of the party, that notebook had 11 entries in it, most of them some version of the same sentence rephrased. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. Gregory Hale, the estate attorney who'd structured our parents' trust 26 years into his practice by the time any of this mattered, had stayed in occasional contact with me as the designated co-signer on Victoria's staggered disbursements. I called him the Monday after the party, voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I want to understand exactly what my co-signature authority actually requires me to approve," I said. "And what happens if I decline an early disbursement request?" He walked me through it carefully, that my role was advisory rather than purely procedural, that the original language his office drafted specifically gave the family co-signer discretion to delay or decline early releases if there was reasonable concern about the funds being used responsibly, a clause his firm includes in nearly every staggered trust they structure for exactly this kind of family situation. "Most clients never use it," he said. "It's there as a break, not a formality. I drafted that language for your parents specifically because they told me, in our very first meeting, that they trusted you to use good judgment even when it wasn't convenient. I don't think either of them imagined it would ever apply quite like this, but the protection is exactly as real as it was the day they signed it." Tom Reyes, the leasing manager at the property management company handling Victoria's apartment building, confirmed for me, once I clarified my legal standing as a co-signer with financial obligations on the lease, exactly what would happen if my monthly contributions stopped. A formal notice to the primary tenant that the unit's income-to-rent ratio no longer met the building's leasing requirements, with a 30-day window to either demonstrate sufficient independent income or vacate. "We see this more than people think," he told me, not unkindly. "Family arrangements like this work fine until they don't, and then it's our office that has to deliver the paperwork." I asked him to send me the relevant section of the lease in writing. He had it in my inbox within the hour, the actual clause highlighted in yellow, the kind of document I read 4 times before I let myself believe it said what I thought it said. I sat with all 3 conversations laid out on my kitchen table that week: Dr. Cross's reframing, Gregory's clause, Tom's lease language, the way I imagine other people lay out tarot cards, except mine all pointed toward the same uncomfortable, entirely sober conclusion. I had built 6 years of financial and emotional scaffolding around a sister who'd just told a room full of her friends, on camera in everyone's memory, if not literally on tape, that none of it had ever mattered to her the way I'd let myself believe. The crisis came 4 days after the party, the Thursday before rent was due, and it arrived as a choice with an actual clock attached to it. Victoria's rent payment, my $600 portion of it, was due Friday at midnight under the building's auto-pay terms Tom had walked me through. I had, by my own accounting, less than 48 hours to either let the payment process automatically the way it had for 4 straight years, or call the building's office and formally withdraw my portion before the deadline, a decision that would trigger the 30-day notice Tom had described. At the same time, a second clock was running quietly in the background. Gregory's office had received, 2 days after the party, a written request from Victoria for an early release of the remaining balance in her trust, citing in the request itself upcoming wedding expenses, a request that needed my co-signature within the same window to be processed before her self-imposed engagement timeline. I didn't sleep well either of those nights. I sat at my kitchen table running the numbers the way Dr. Cross had once suggested I try, not the dollar amounts, but the actual ledger of the relationship itself. 6 years of disbursement without a single matching deposit. I made an actual list at one point, 2 columns on a legal pad, one labeled given and one labeled received, and stopped after 11 items in the first column because my hand had started to feel less like I was writing and more like I was finally translating something I'd known wordlessly for years. My hands were unsteady enough on that second night that I knocked over a full glass of water reaching for my phone, and I remember staring at the spreading puddle on the table for a long moment before I even moved to clean it up, the way you sometimes need a small, manageable disaster to remind yourself you're still capable of reacting to anything at all. I called Dr. Cross for an emergency session Thursday afternoon, the day before both deadlines converged. "You don't owe her an explanation timed to her convenience," she told me. "You also don't owe yourself a decision made entirely out of anger. Those are 2 different traps, and you have time to avoid both if you're honest with yourself about which one you're actually at risk of falling into." I sat with the question longer than I expected to. By Thursday evening, I knew which decision I was actually going to make, and it had stopped being about anger somewhere in the last 24 hours and started being about something closer to clarity. Friday morning, I called Tom first. "I need to formally withdraw my financial contribution to the lease, effective this billing cycle," I told him. "I understand that triggers the 30-day notice process for the primary tenant. I can process that, he said. I'll need it in writing for our file, but the verbal authorization is enough to start the clock today if that's what you want. That's what I want. I called Gregory's office next. I'm declining to co-sign the early disbursement request, I said. I'd like that documented formally, along with my reasoning, in case it's ever relevant later. Understood, he said. I'll note that the funds remain on the original staggered schedule per the trust's terms. She'll receive the standard quarterly disbursement as planned. The full balance releases at 30 or upon marriage, whichever comes first, exactly as your parents' attorney originally structured it. I texted Victoria once that same afternoon, 4 sentences I'd drafted and redrafted the way I once drafted scrapbook captions, except this time I didn't soften a single word past what I actually meant. I heard everything you said Saturday. I'm not paying rent anymore starting this cycle, and I'm not co-signing the early trust release. You have 30 days of notice from the building to sort out your housing. I love you, but I'm done being convenient. She called 4 times within the hour. I let all 4 go to voicemail. The 5th call I answered, mostly because I'd promised Dr. Cross I wouldn't simply disappear, that disappearing wasn't the same thing as a boundary. You can't actually be doing this, Victoria said, voice already climbing toward the register I recognized from every crisis call of the last 6 years. I can, and I am, I said. I was drunk. I didn't mean any of it. You know how Chloe gets me riled up. You weren't drunk enough to lie to Aunt Helen's face about why I was leaving, I said. You weren't drunk 18 months ago when you told Becca the necklace story as a joke either. This isn't one bad night. I just finally noticed the pattern. There was a long silence on her end, the kind I'd never once heard from her in 6 years of calls, because for 6 years, I'd always been the one filling silences before they had a chance to stretch. What am I supposed to tell Brad? She finally said, which told me, more clearly than anything else that week, exactly which part of all this had actually frightened her. The 30 days that followed were not gentle for either of us, though I think only one of us had spent 6 years pretending they would never have to be. Victoria scrambled for a roommate, found one through a co-worker with 11 days to spare before the building's deadline, and moved into a smaller unit 2 buildings over rather than lose the lease entirely. A fact Tom confirmed to me only because, as the former co-signer of record, the building was legally required to notify me the file had been formally closed. The new unit, by his account, ran about $150 less than the old one, but required a roommate she'd known for less than 3 months, a detail that struck me less as karma and more as the simple, unglamorous math of a budget finally meeting its actual income for the first time in 6 years. Aunt Helen called me twice that month, the first time simply to check in, the second time to tell me, gently, that she'd had her own version of that conversation with Victoria's mother, my mother, decades earlier, about a different sister, a different kind of one-sided closeness, a family pattern none of us had apparently noticed repeating itself until it landed on the 2 of us. Your mother eventually drew the same kind of line, she told me. It took her longer than it took you. I think that's actually a point in your favor, not against it. I asked her carefully what had happened with her own sister. We stopped speaking for 2 years, she said. Then we found our way back to something smaller and more honest than what we'd had before. I'm not telling you that to scare you. I'm telling you because it's possible eventually if you both actually want it. Brad reached out once, awkwardly, mostly to ask whether I was okay with everything, a question I appreciated more than I expected to from a man I barely knew, since it was more than Victoria had asked me directly in over a year. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd never actually known about the rent arrangement before that night, that Victoria had always described herself to him as fully independent, paying her own way, building toward the wedding on her own terms. I didn't know what to do with that information except file it away as one more small piece of a story I was only now getting to see in full. The engagement, as far as I know, is still moving forward on its original timeline, though I've heard from Aunt Helen that the wedding planning has gotten noticeably quieter. Fewer group chat updates, no further mention of a bachelorette guest list I was never going to be invited to anyway. Victoria sent one real message, 3 weeks into the 30 days, longer than her usual texts, the first one in 6 years that didn't open with a crisis already in progress. She wrote that she didn't expect me to forgive any of it right away, that she'd spent the last 2 weeks actually rereading the scrapbook instead of just owning a copy of it, and that she didn't have a good explanation for why she'd let herself believe performing cruelty for an audience was easier than simply telling 4 friends the truth, which was that she didn't know how to be close to someone without resenting needing them. I read it 4 times. I didn't write back that week. I wanted to mean whatever I eventually said back to her, rather than just saying something soothing because the silence after her message felt uncomfortable, the same trap Dr. Cross had warned me about from the other direction. It's been 5 months now. I still see Dr. Cross every other week, mostly to keep practicing the specific, unfamiliar muscle of letting a silence sit instead of rushing to fill it for someone else's comfort. She told me recently that the goal was never to stop loving my sister, only to stop mistaking the size of my own sacrifices for proof that the love was being returned. Victoria and I talk maybe twice a month now, shorter calls, ones where I've started noticing, slowly, imperfectly, with real effort on both sides, that she occasionally asks a follow-up question about my own week and then actually waits long enough to hear the answer. I went to her apartment last month, the new one, smaller than the old place. No extra $600 quietly disappearing from my account the week before her paycheck clears. Her roommate, a quiet woman named Priya who works in pharmacy logistics, made us both tea while Victoria and I sat on a secondhand couch that used to belong to someone from her old building. She'd kept the scrapbook on her actual bookshelf this time, not under a coffee table. I didn't ask if that meant anything specific. I've decided I don't need everything to mean something right away anymore. Aunt Helen still brings up that doorway moment sometimes, usually with a small, satisfied smile, the way you'd describe watching a long overdue weather system finally break. I used to think the worst part of that night was hearing what Victoria actually thought of me. I've come to believe the worst part was actually 6 years earlier, the night of the accident, when I quietly decided that being needed was close enough to being loved, and never once stopped to ask whether the two were actually the same thing. They were never the same thing. I just needed a ruined cake and a house full of strangers to finally believe it.